podcast for unlocking potential by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome to everyone, dear listeners, to today's episode of our podcast. And once again, I have a really interesting guest with me, whom I met a few months ago at an event. We hit it off right away and had some really great conversations. That's why it didn't take long for the idea to be born, that he would come to me as a guest on our podcast, Wordy Impulse. I want to give you a very warm welcome, Daniel Kießling. It's great to have you here, Daniel.
Hey Uli, thanks for having me. I'm absolutely thrilled.
That's wonderful, and so am I. And we'll jump right in by first talking a bit about you and your background, so the listeners can develop some empathy, get to know the person. That's something we always do, but we don't go into it extensively, just enough to create a sense of connection, to let the sound and the feeling come across. And then we'll dive into 3 topics today that were important to us in preparing for this. And that's also the basic structure, the snippets, so to speak, for today. Content topic number 1. What's new in personnel development, and therefore also in learning? I think that's something you can't overestimate, given how quickly the world is changing. Especially with technological progress, knowledge, and so on, development is just becoming more and more important. And we've also got modernity in the title. So, in that sense, what's new in personnel development? What's new in learning? Our second important point, our second snippet, our second highlight, is the connection to the topic of our podcast. So, important values in learning. What actually promotes learning? Which values might not be so helpful? We might get a bit philosophical here, but also quite concrete. Because I think learning is often seen as too abstract. It's viewed in terms of content. And I believe, Daniel, you're already nodding. I can tell that the value dimension is maybe still a bit underestimated here. And then, a really important topic for us, and you, as part of the younger generation, are of course the one who picked up on AI really quickly. So to speak, like AI, is revolutionizing learning and, with it, personnel development. I've also been involved in this topic for quite a while now. So I'm really curious. In our preliminary talk, we touched a bit on the direction things could go and where this conversation might lead us. All right, let's get started, Daniel. And yes, you have a nice solo business called LearnWise. And the W is capitalized, which is a nice double meaning as well. You're also a lecturer and examiner at the Chamber of Industry and Commerce, but the main focus here today is your self-employment, and that's all about personnel development. That's the core around which everything revolves. But maybe you could start by picking up the thread and spinning it a bit, so our listeners can get an idea of where Daniel started and why he went in this or that direction. Went. I'm rolling the ball over to you, nice and smooth. Your turn, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Uli. Honestly, I kind of stumbled into it by accident on the topic of personnel development, but maybe I'll start a step or 2 earlier. I've now been working for over 17 years in a large corporation, a wholesale trading company, and I've held many different positions there, starting with my training in sales. After a few stops along the way, also in sales as an assistant to the managing director and in specialized sales. And then, after a few detours, my journey took me, actually, one thing was really crucial, and that was getting my trainer's certification back then, which led me into personnel development. The company decided to put a very strong focus on training, on in-company training, and wanted to bring in experts to support people on site, not just the trainees, but especially others as well. The trainers at the many different locations, because this whole topic of training, or as I later learned, general personnel development, is becoming more and more complex and demanding. I really dove into it. And a few years later, in 2020, I basically made the switch. From training to, in quotation marks, the big leagues, personnel development for everyone. And since then, I've been trying to establish and offer low-threshold options and formats there, things people can access and consume at any time without much effort. The idea is to help them rediscover the fun in learning, which they might have lost a bit over the past few years.
Yeah, that's a good point. It has to be enjoyable, too. That way, people are much more open-minded. I'd like to jump in again, because you put it nicely just now. You mentioned that you spent some time working as an assistant to the managing director. And that's always interesting. Yeah, we also have a lot of people who are career advisors, both men and women, or young people who sometimes ask about this. Or they ask, what is it like when you start out somewhere as an assistant to the managing director? And my point has always been, hey folks, it's definitely not easy. You really have to do a lot. But that's how you get to know a company extremely well from all sorts of different angles. And it's actually a real boost for your development. How did you see it?
It was definitely the same for me. Up until then, I only knew the company from the sales side. As a salesperson, and often, I couldn't really understand my decisions from the ground up, of course. Especially business decisions, they're not always pleasant and not always positive. But my role back then, as assistant to the management or managing director, really gave me a lot of insights. I was able to communicate with groups or meet people who gave me a completely different perspective on things I might see a bit differently now, and from which I still benefit today. So, getting a holistic view of, as you said, entrepreneurial activity.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like an organism, where you get to know its behaviors, so to speak. You mentioned different perspectives, and then also mechanisms. The processes that take place there, how compromises are found, how negotiations might be conducted, but also, ultimately, how leadership is exercised, it's all really fascinating, I think. And yeah, you mentioned that you've been working for a long time in a large retail corporation, and you also talked a bit about the steps you took there. But now I'm curious, how did you end up becoming self-employed, and what were your reasons for it? Maybe also your goals, where you say, yeah, that's where I want to make a difference, that's where I want to get involved.
Yeah, here too, it was more by chance. But I think in life there are a few moments when you have to decide which direction you want to go. Whether it's always just coincidence or whether a lot of things happened beforehand that led to it, that might be a bit too philosophical for now. But here too, I ended up getting into it unexpectedly. Earlier, you mentioned my many years of work, also as an IHK examiner, and up until then, I was only an examiner. And back then, the IHK approached me and asked if, because of my commitment and my interest in this training profession, I could imagine taking on the other side as well, specifically, preparing people for the exam. And at that time, it was right in the middle of COVID, at the beginning of 2021, in January. It was exactly what was needed at the time, because I was really focused on new learning formats then. So everything that had worked well and was established up to that point, in-person formats, or even a bit of small talk in the coffee kitchen, where you definitely picked up a thing or two, suddenly weren't as available as before. So, what formats can we establish instead? There was a lot going on in my head at that time. And as is sometimes the case in big corporations, you don't always have all the freedoms you'd like. But back then, the opportunity came up to take things into my own hands, to quickly implement one idea or another, and nowadays, you probably call that being agile. So I seized the opportunity and jumped right in. From the time I became self-employed or started freelancing, I launched my very own independent business venture, and since that time, I've been consistently active and deeply involved within this professional industry alongside my main job, on a dedicated mission to help people get even better at what they're already quite good at, or to provide comprehensive support in specific areas where they see significant potential for growth. so they can truly maximize their full potential and make the absolute most of every opportunity.
Yeah, that's where our paths cross as well. At Profiling Values, our slogan is Explore Your Potential. And in a way, you're right there with us. We're more on the diagnostic side, while you're more about actually accumulating knowledge and acquiring skills. But the entrepreneurial connection here is also between us in terms of learning approaches, which I really like. Profiling values, so that's where we overlap, and that's what brings us together now. You just mentioned 2020 and also brought up the pandemic. There were completely new challenges for learning and for personnel development. So if we look at our first headline, what's new in personnel development and in learning? If I ask you now, as a learning expert, could you give us a few keywords? What should we focus on? Or how can our listeners take something away for themselves so they can hear from you what's new in this area?
Yeah. I think what has developed so dynamically in recent years, it's the speed at which topics or an entire environment can change. So really, the speed at which things are changing is, I think, the biggest innovation, and it's still just as dynamic as ever. I also believe that in the future, the pace of change will only keep increasing. Both the environment and the content, it's a huge challenge for all learners to constantly stay up to date. The ways to get information and to learn have, of course, changed tremendously in recent years or have increased tremendously as well. That means there's almost an overabundance of opportunities to further your education or to smarten up. And the expectations of people who are willing to keep developing themselves have, I think, also gone up. So the days of, I'll just do my job for years and my boss will let me know if something's not right, I think those days are over now, thankfully.
Yeah, I also think it's great that people are, so to speak, taking their fate into their own hands when it comes to personal development. And my credo has been for many, many years that everyone in their professional life is the manager of their own skills. That means they really have to keep themselves in shape so that they're valuable on the job market. So he, she, or they. And you also mentioned the opportunities, which sometimes are almost too many. Isn't there, if I ask critically, a risk of oversaturation in professional development? For an individual, but maybe also for entire companies that are just hopping from one thing to the next and have no clear direction. How do you see it?
Yeah, well, in my opinion, that risk is definitely there. I think what's important here is having a good strategy. So again, we're talking about the really basic fundamentals of entrepreneurship, which unfortunately often get lost or don't get the attention they need in the rush of everyday business. When we think about how changes are implemented in companies, how strategies are rolled out, I think it's always important to consider, okay, what do my employees need to learn for that? What do they need to know in the future in order to actually put this strategy into practice? Which levers are we pulling now, and where do I want to go in the future? What do I want my employees to have? So, where do I want to take my workforce? What skills will they need in the future to be able to do this? Like you said, if I don't have that, then everyone just learns whatever they think is right. And right now, the range of options is huge. If I just think about where most people, probably by now, especially the very young, get their information from, it's probably even from social media. And when I think about how much of that content is sometimes unverified, you really have to pay close attention to make sure it's the right content and the right amount of it.
Well, I've been around for a few years now. I'm a bit older. I come from the analog days, when it used to be, staff development, here's the course catalog. And at first, I didn't even understand what my first boss meant when he said that. Course catalog, I immediately thought of trains and connections, and so on. But it was actually about courses, and you could pick something out for yourself. So, it was really just a total scattergun approach, so to speak. But it became clear pretty quickly, hang on, especially when it comes to high-potential employees and so on. I have to be careful. I need to take a closer look at that, and that's where personnel diagnostics come into play. That's also where profile and values is often involved, to determine where someone stands, so that you can then say, okay, now let's create the so-called IDP, the Individual Development Plan. So, here we go. Tailored or custom-made for the person, you could say, so you can determine what you need and what you don't. Because the downside of the scattergun approach was that people would end up getting bored. They'd end up wasting their valuable capacities on things like that. So here, having a strategy, on the one hand, as you put it well, where do I want my workforce to be? And I think that's where a lot of companies struggle, probably regardless of their size. Sure, the bigger ones naturally think more strategically, but I also know plenty of small and medium-sized ones. And then, so what does that actually mean, broken down to departments, areas, teams, and individual people? When I look at it, that's already a massive, massive task. Is it even possible to do that without consulting? So, you probably need a lot of people like you. How do you see it?
Ideally, in my opinion, it's actually the manager's job to think about exactly these things. But nowadays, of course, it's also become common to have so-called business partners at your side. That means, if I don't have this know-how or the resources for this know-how in-house, or don't bring it with me as a single person, which I think is totally legitimate, then it's incredibly important to set yourself up well and get good advice accordingly. Whether it always has to be an expensive consultant, I don't know. Everyone has to decide that for themselves. But I believe that a sensible and professional approach to this topic is incredibly important, and not to take it lightly. We're talking about people, and you just mentioned that the content is individual. But just as much, the people themselves and the way they process content are highly individual. And here too, the GIS channels are probably the worst possible tool.
Great, so that's actually a nice way to wrap up our first topic. So here we have the speeds, the possibilities, and it takes a strategy, a good approach. And if I now set aside the speed at which things are happening nowadays and look at the second point, what important values play a role in learning? When I use the word values, for me it always carries a certain continuity, a depth, and also a certain consistency. And if I pass it over to you, of course, I've also given it some thought, putting myself in the shoes of the learner. Put myself in their place. What are the kinds of values where we could say to our listeners, yes, that's important. If you have that, then it really takes root. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. In my opinion, it actually ties in quite a bit with what I just said earlier about not taking things lightly. Taking people seriously, taking individuals and their needs seriously as well, showing empathy, especially in times when so many procedures, processes, and data play a role, and a lot of it is being automated. In my personal opinion, I truly believe it's incredibly important to really keep a close eye on the actual people behind it all, and to maintain a very good, open dialogue with them. We need to take them seriously, to actively support their long-term professional development throughout their entire journey, and to be a reliable, steady support in various situations that are often quite uncertain, extremely fast-paced, and inherently unstable.
For me, that also brings in the aspect of partnership. Robert S. Hartman, whose value mathematics forms the basis of our profiling values, also did a really great job of analyzing the historical economic cycles. In the beginning, people were basically just used as labor, no matter how badly they were treated in the factory, and then through the different stages up to transactional leadership, where you have incentives, but ultimately all the way to transformational leadership goals, which means entering into a partnership. Wanting to work together for the long term. And then, of course, you have to actually follow through with this plan or partnership. So, taking things seriously, as you just said, I think that's a really, really important value in this context, and of course the empathy that comes from it. I've been thinking about critical self-reflection as an important value. When it comes to modern learning, how do you see it? How does that resonate with you? And maybe you can also make a connection to other values there.
Critical self-reflection. So, which group did you have in mind there?
Ideally, always with everyone, because when we first met, I actually brought that up with the group as well. Because I always point that out, too. And then I just asked, well, have you ever heard from someone when you asked them how self-reflective they are? That someone would answer you, no, I'm not self-reflective at all. That just doesn't happen. So, everyone thinks of themselves as very self-reflective, critical, and introspective. But very few people actually have anything to compare themselves to. We do have those comparisons, but that would be going too far right now. So, on the one hand, it's about, well, where did that thought come from, Daniel? Yes, there are those quick high flyers, the confident top performers who might sometimes be a bit too quick, too taken with themselves, and say, I already know how to do all this. And then there are also those who basically think, yeah, I've got my shop under control, I know exactly how things work, and so on. And maybe they're not self-critical enough. They don't question their leadership skills when it comes to developing their people. So, in that respect, I see it on all sides. What does that trigger in you?
Yeah, that's exactly why I asked the follow-up question again, because I think I have a similar approach or a similar thought about that. On the one hand, from so-called managers or leaders who learn about this topic or make education possible or available, and also reflect on themselves, even critically, in order to stay up to date, to provide exactly the framework that the individual people need. And on the other hand, also from the learners who are on the other side, and who have often been in their roles for many years and are often pros at what they do. But the world around them has changed incredibly quickly over the past few years, or maybe even over the past decades. Things have moved at an unbelievable pace. And what I've done, and especially how I've done it, might actually need to be optimized again. On the other hand, I think the very junior people, as I'll call them now, who often enter the workforce with a certain confidence or a certain sense of entitlement, maybe because that's how it was taught in school, because that's how it was learned. In school, it was just taken for granted that I could get information whenever I needed it. And we're already the top trained people who are now entering the job market and are in high demand. So, I think this topic comes up at every stage of your career, if you will, and I believe it's really, really beneficial. It's also important to take a critical look at what I actually want or what I need. Where do I personally want to go? And how do I get there as well? Who can accompany me on this path towards my goal? And who might be able to help me achieve it?
Yeah, cool. I really like that. We just have to watch out because time is flying. Very quickly, I'll just mention two values I've been thinking about, but I think they fit quite well. They're already covered by what you said, having real openness and also the idea of collaboration. So, being open, really, because things move fast. And that brings us right to our next topic, when we talk about AI, all the new things that are developing there, and collaboration. We're not all on our own, we need others more and more. In the increasing complexity of our working world. And that's why collaboration is so important. I also think it's incredibly important when it comes to learning. That you think about it, okay, you go in this direction, I'll go there, and so on, and then we come together accordingly. And maybe that leads us nicely right into our last main topic, how AI is revolutionizing learning and professional development. Back in our first preliminary talk, Daniel, we were already so deep into this that we could have almost started recording right then. So now I'll pass the ball over to you again. How is AI revolutionizing learning and professional development? Give us a bit of a serve from your side, and then we'll volley the ideas back and forth. Yeah.
Well, I really believe that everything happening around AI, or everything currently associated with AI or artificial intelligence, is going to be an incredible accelerator for the whole topic of professional development. Then, in many areas, as you said, professional development will truly be revolutionized. I also think it will, to some extent, be the factor that removes the mask from any managers or people in charge, because suddenly things might come to light that are no longer on the manager's to-do list, but instead happen automatically, and then completely different. Values or even tasks will be required of managers that aren't about technical expertise or leadership skills, but are truly interpersonal.
Which basically means that there would need to be a shift in competencies. Or isn't it often the case that people retreat into technical matters, just to avoid having to navigate the uncertain terrain of interpersonal skills?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Well, I don't think anything is shifting. I just think that, especially these days, it's easy to hide behind something else and use something else as an excuse. Whether it's some Excel spreadsheets or other tasks that just need to get done somehow. Tasks that, in the future, might be automated or handled by artificial intelligence. And maybe that's why I end up saying a word or two less to my employees than I should.
And that also means that I actually focus on, let's say, certain points of knowledge. I'll just call them that for now. So, things that are analyzed from data somewhere, and I start connecting them with each other and, above all, connecting them with people, in order to operate at a different level. To be on a journey that is truly human, so to speak, and beneath that, it's the AI that ultimately delivers the results for us. And then we can't hide it anymore, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, definitely. So I think the points that might blur things here and there will increase. I also believe that the topics themselves will change. People will be able to do things themselves much more quickly. They'll find topics they want to pursue and where they want to engage with them in the future, provided that companies or even managers make these topics available.
So it's a bit of a liberation, so to speak, for people themselves, because it's much easier to drive things forward in terms of content. You have to invest much less of your own time and learning capacity, if I can put it that way. A lot can be provided, and then you can push things forward more effectively. I see. Am I understanding this correctly? Because you also once said in our preliminary talk, never slack off again. Maybe that also has a bit to do with taking off the masks. But of course, learning will also become different and faster. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think that because of the access, so if I ask an artificial intelligence, a generative AI, what do I need to know if I want or need to be an expert in topic XY? Then I get a quick answer within seconds. The 5 most important topics I should focus on. And if I then ask next, what are the fundamental things I need to know about these 5 topics? Or create a study plan for me on these following 5 topics. Then I have it in a matter of seconds. Of course, it's always smart to verify and research these topics or answers. But I no longer have anyone telling me, hey, you have to learn the following, go find it yourself. But get some materials on that. Sit yourself down in a library and look for brochures or do research on the following topics, worthy effort. Getting access to the content is much more work than actually learning the content itself. Those days are definitely over now, yeah.
That means you're immediately at the starting block, so to speak, for the sprint or the obstacle course. And it's simply expected that, so to speak, your background is strong enough that you can, I'll say, do cross-checks, you say verifications, and also that you can link different things together so that you can actually make use of this input. And for me, that's always, well, I work with AI every day too. By now, in various fields already, even in consulting when it comes to personnel development, I keep thinking, wow, what an incredible relief this is. In the past, I would have said, oh, now I really have to dig in, now I have to take a look, we need to ask around, we need to go there. But now, I can just jump right in and take a test run. Something like that. Where are you using it at the moment? You mean the AI, if I may ask?
Yeah, actually almost daily, really, I am. In addition to my work at LearnWise, where I do a lot of consulting and also active training, I'm also active on social media. And just when it comes to creating short Instagram reels, I get help with scripting, I let it help me. Helping with the visualization of content so that maybe even an image is generated from it. I've used it for really simple things, like bedtime stories for my 2 little kids.
Bye.
Getting support from AI. And of course, you also have to build up a lot of skills alongside that. You just mentioned connecting the content and maybe even drawing conclusions from it. But also, interpersonal skills. So what do I do when all the knowledge in the world is suddenly available in seconds? What does that do to me? How do I deal with that? How do I talk to other people who might also have this access all of a sudden? Somehow, everyone is an expert, so what are we even talking about, and how do we talk to each other? All of these topics matter. I think it's important to really train and engage with these things over the next few years. Yeah.
Well said. And I'll return to the point that you brought up a little bit earlier in our conversation, that focusing on these interpersonal aspects, these valuable capacities are actually being liberated and made more available now, as we get this kind of support. And that it shouldn't push us to just accumulate even more knowledge. And not just add even more content and make more connections here, but to say, yes, we can engage in discourse, we can respond to each other and talk more together, instead of everyone just muddling along in their own little working groups. So, if we do it right, interpersonally, and in terms of society as a whole, we actually have a huge opportunity for gain, if I understood you correctly earlier.
I actually see it as a huge opportunity. However, as you said, we have to approach it wisely, also on a societal level, and not just for ourselves. Hide behind the next technology, push it forward and say, yeah, now we all somehow have to learn how to build and establish artificial intelligences or generative AI, but really also say, okay, I trust that the technology will take care of the things that aren't actually fun and aren't really human by nature. And now I have enough time for interpersonal things, to talk with each other, to share successes, to share worries, to overcome challenges together, and to support each other.
Wow, Daniel, beautifully said. Nothing can top that. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about this really important topic. I find it super interesting. Maybe we can continue this at a suitable opportunity. I'd also like to thank our listeners for sticking with us right to the end. And I'm always happy if we get a like or some feedback, whether it's on LinkedIn, Instagram, or of course on podcast platforms. It was really, really great talking with you, Daniel. A heartfelt thank you to you as well at this point.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Dear listeners, see you again very soon. Thank you all. Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao.